Friends, welcome back to this, our final session of today. Thank you again on behalf of the Presbyterian Foundation for joining us here at our second day of learning. Our presenter this afternoon is Paul Grier. Paul is a vice president at the foundation, and he brings a lifetime of expertise both from within and outside of the church. Paul is a sought-after resource among presbyteries and churches looking to dive deep into issues around property use, development, and redevelopment. So far today, we've looked at the topic of mission and vision. We've explored what different options and some of their implications can look like. We've talked about the central role that discernment needs to play in this conversation. And now, we are going to hear some of the nuts and bolts of property issues. But before Paul begins, I want to thank Maggie Harmon, Milena Smith, Sarita Bell, Robin Davis-Sakula, and all the staff at the foundation. So many people behind the scenes make events like this possible, and there's always a danger in naming names. But those of you who worked on this, you know who you are, and we are so grateful. Our Zoom webinar has been produced by Nathan Young. Nathan, thank you for making this second day of learning possible. Again, all three workshops will be recorded with the link sent out on Tuesday of next week to all of our registrants. A reminder that the chat function has been disabled, but you are encouraged to use the Q&A button to submit any questions. The harder the question, the better for Paul. Paul has been told that his presentation, including questions, will run between 60 and 90 minutes. I promise you we will hold him to that. Please don't hesitate to submit questions, and if we can't get to all of them, we will do our best to have our presenters submit written responses to the ones we can't get to today. Again, please use the Q&A button, not the chat, to submit questions for our presenters. With all of that, thank you again for joining us today. Paul Grier, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, friends, and thank you for joining us for this third in the series of today's day of learning. I can promise you that we will not go 90 minutes. If we do, it will be completely Joseph Moore's fault. Joseph did not mention the very important role that he has played, and we are grateful for his service to the church, to the foundation, and in the production of today's activity. So if you heard Maggie Harmon this morning, I'm on Eastern time, so excuse the references there. If you heard Maggie Harmon, if you heard Robert Hay and Olanda Carr, you heard stirring and inspiring presentations of the why and the what. For the next few minutes, we will talk about the how. This will be much more mechanical. This will not be soaring oratory. This will be the how we do what we do. I did not go to seminary. I am a former business person that has been with the foundation for 18 years now. I'm an 8th generation Presbyterian. I'm a ruling elder at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Greenville, South Carolina. So my context is coming from the business landscape. And I will be using more commercial corporate terminology than, say, church language. Since Project Regeneration began in 2012, we've worked with over 1,000 congregations in almost every state. North Dakota and Hawaii, we're still waiting for those phone calls. And as we move and have moved into a version 2.0 of Project Regeneration, our name for a church asset transformation program, we have abided by certain guiding principles. We are a disinterested third party. Now, keep in mind, there's a big difference between disinterested and uninterested. We come to our work objective. We do not bring foregone conclusions. We do not try to push churches to one decision or another. We're not going to try to steer you, but we seek to walk alongside you as you make important steps and travel an important journey. As my colleagues have said before, and I will repeat, the Presbyterian Foundation does not have polity authority. We are a resource. We are not a regulator. And so the work that we do is often done concurrently with presbytery leaders and congregational leaders. We do not have the authority to tell you what to do. And in fact, we cannot tell you what to do. We also will not offer unrealistic expectations. Some of the conversations that we have are a bit uncomfortable. We will look at the church's finances. We will look at the state of your properties, your campus, if you will. And while we don't claim to be experts, we have seen a lot of situations. We have participated in about 125 transactions over the last few years. We believe in speaking plainly, in offering step-by-step action plans, and yet we remain sensitive to the difficulty and the emotion of working with folks, many of whom are fatigued, many of whom are discouraged as they think through what God's calling them to be in this time and in their place. I'm going to open a PowerPoint. I'm going to hope it works. There we go. So we're going to talk about finances related to church property. You will hear me use the term core property and ancillary property. A question during Robert and Olanda's presentation was, does a manse count? Well, of course, the answer is yes. It is not core to the church's work, but it is an asset of the worshiping community. And yes, we've participated in a bunch of manse sales and manse leases. So as we talk about property, we will talk about core property, we'll talk about ancillary property. We have talked about the sequence of our work, the why, the what, the how. And friends, let's face it, we Presbyterians love to jump right to the how. But if we try to address the how, before we've established the why that Maggie talked about, the what that Olanda and Robert talked about, if we jump to the how, we almost always have to retrace some of our steps. Going in this order, why and then what and then how, costs less and, believe it or not, actually saves time. Most importantly, it is the most likely approach that results in a positive outcome. And so Maggie did a terrific job of defining the why. And for those of you that didn't hear her presentation, I would encourage you to check out the recorded version. Trust me, you'll find it valuable. Olanda and Robert, who also did a marvelous job in defining the what, talked about various options. And I'm going to spend just a moment on this because this does establish some of the framework of the how. Your situation might be an aging in place model where your congregation or a congregation in your presbytery is going to keep doing what they've been doing for as long as they are able. It may be a continuing congregation with a sale or a lease or a sharing of some of your real property. There are two obvious options. One is going solo without a financial partner. Another is a joint venture where another enterprise is also involved. Mergers are pretty rare in the Presbyterian Church USA. We usually run about 20 of them a year. And then, of course, there is dissolution for those congregations that have concluded that their time as a visible worshiping community is drawing to a close. The key elements in defining the how once the what has been established appear on your screen. Identifying and naming the transaction, and don't just jump over this. And please, don't use creative language. You remember that part about speaking clearly? If your church is going to merge with another church, go ahead and call it a merger. Because what we have found in our experience is creative language tends to lead to more confusion, particularly among the membership of the church. Identifying partners and potential partners and key stakeholders, estimating the time horizon, and we'll talk about that. Identifying obstacles or complicating factors, identifying the approvals that are needed. Certainly the approval of your presbytery, unless you're a chapter 7 church, and there are just not that many of those. But there are also other approvals, particularly those of you that are in New York State. Larry Beasley, are you listening? New York State has lots of different requirements. And of course, evaluating the financial implications. And so we talked about these different whats and the hows that go along with this, the HOW, how, will depend on the type of transaction that you are undertaking. And so if you haven't figured out the what, the how is most difficult. We see these as the most common type of scenarios. Maintenance mode, continuing to do what the church has done without significant change. A sale of all or part of your church campus. Leasing or renting space to others. Partnerships, joint ventures. The ones that are really popular right now that are being pursued in lots of areas are affordable housing. 15 years ago, the popular moment was senior adult housing. There are many, many opportunities before us because, let's face it, the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians tend to have the best real estate. At least east of the Mississippi, we often got there first. In many situations, these types of activities involve the creation of new entities. And while that is not negative, there are some obstacles you want to be aware of and careful of. And then, of course, dissolution, which is the gracious and graceful conclusion of ministry, where a congregation celebrates its life together. And then that life, as the worshiping community, draws to a close. That is both a time of understandable sadness, but also a time of reflecting on how much good an individual congregation was able to accomplish in the lives of its members and in the life of its community. And so as we identify partners and key stakeholders in a congregational setting, obviously the leaders of the church, the members of the church, the presbytery, the municipality, lenders, business partners, advisors, and neighbors. You might be surprised to see neighbors listed. Neighbors are frequently left out of the consideration. And we're not just talking about the community impact, those that would miss you if you sold your property, if you moved, or if you closed. Neighbors are actually one of the groups that can prevent your initiative from going forward. We have seen it before, we will see it again. Sometimes the neighborhood doesn't like what you have planned. And neighborhood protests can be very well organized, very effective. I mean, friends, I live in Greenville, South Carolina. We're kind of like the buckle of the Bible Belt. And I have seen church initiatives on more than one occasion get stopped in their tracks because of resistance from the neighborhood. So we identify and we name these key stakeholders. We have to take a look at the time horizon. This stuff takes longer than we usually think it will. Now, a lease or a sharing relationship can be implemented pretty quickly. Maybe that is another congregation that shares space in your campus. Maybe it's leasing the second floor of the Christian education building, all those classrooms that aren't being used. Maybe that's leasing it out to the school district. We did a situation like that in New York State. If you're thinking about selling, remember that the average church property sale in the United States takes 18 months on average to close. And that's measured from the time the property is put up for sale to the time the ownership actually changes. If you're going to sell your property, be prepared. Most contracts fall through. 3/4 of all purchase contracts for religious properties fall through. The primary reason is the buyer's inability to secure funding. And we're happy to talk with you offline about some strategies for testing buyers before you invest a lot of time and a lot of energy and get your hopes up. There are ways to test buyers to get a pretty good feel for how serious and how capable they might be. Merger work usually takes 18 to 24 months in our system. Most discussions don't go anywhere. Mergers are hard work. And in many cases, we've been told by churches, well, we would rather just dissolve than merge. Now, I'm not saying I understand that, but I appreciate the candor and I appreciate the difficulty that these faithful churchgoers are undertaking as they think about a new future. So mergers take a good long while. In the non-denominational space, by the way, the average merger takes about 150 days. So our brothers and sisters in the non-denominational space move much faster than we do when it comes to merging two congregations into one. As I mentioned a few moments ago, there are usually about 20 church mergers per year in the PCUSA. Dissolution speed can vary. We've worked with one church that's on a 5-year track. We have worked with other churches that from the decision point to the final turning of the keys over to the presbytery leadership was about 90 days. Redevelopment, taking the property that you have and constructing something totally new and different, is a very time-consuming process. Typically, these processes take about 5 years. I'm familiar with one in Charlotte. It's a United Methodist congregation that has fundamentally reinvented itself, and it has been a 7-year odyssey. Now, why do we talk about the time horizon? We talk about the time horizon because many of the churches that approach us don't have a 5-year runway. Many of them will run out of money or run out of people long before that. And so we need to gauge our expectations based on the capacity of the worshiping community. And we encourage the asking of these questions. Do you have enough time to do what you say you want to do? Do you have enough money? Will your money last that long? Will your people stay that long? Will your energy last that long? We see that the greatest danger facing the churches we work with is not the number of people, it's not the amount of money. It is fatigue after doing the same thing year after year without seeing results. So we encourage you to identify upfront complicating factors, complexity in the ownership of the parcel that you're considering, reversionary or restrictive clauses, and these can go back 100 years. So one of the things that I'll always say is, have you done a title search? And churches are always like, well, the church has only been here 50 years and we've been around that long. Do the title search anyway. It's a good use of $300. 90% of the time, you'll find that the church has clear title. 10% of the time, you'll find that your plans are going to be significantly complicated. There are, of course, regulatory constraints like zoning restrictions, historic district, historic status for the church, environmental hazard, and cemeteries. Cemeteries are a big one. We do a lot of work with cemeteries. You would want to identify early on the approvals that would be needed. Who has the authority? If you're a church that has a session and a board of trustees, which group would be signing contracts? What presbytery policies are in place? We have found that many policies exist across the United States, and many presbyteries often handle a 2021 transaction differently than a 2019 transaction. We mention opt-out congregations. If that's you, you know who you are. Clarity in communications with buyers or lenders or partners. We encourage you to set expectations conservatively. We also encourage you to give full disclosure of the process of selling a church. Most buyers are surprised to learn that it takes 3 votes to sell a church in the Presbyterian system: the session, the congregation, and the presbytery. Essential tasks when it comes to the financial implications: defining your current financial position. If you don't have accurate or up-to-date financial statements, you're going to find that selling a piece of property is made significantly more difficult. Understanding income streams, understanding your member giving patterns. One of the things that we offer at the foundation is an analysis of giving patterns so that you can see your dependence upon a very small number of donors, or perhaps your very oldest donors. We will help you think through your cash flow requirements, the timing of your cash needs, and whether or not those resources are readily available. Essential tasks also include projecting continuing and new expenditures. Maybe you're going to move into new space before your old space has been sold. Well, you know the old saying, you're going to have probably not 2 mortgage payments, but you're going to have 2 insurance bills, 2 utilities expenses, et cetera, et cetera. Projecting your continuing and your new income streams. Assuming the loss of some members, we have never seen a significant redevelopment or merger or relocation that did not result in the loss of some members. The average that we understand from our non-denominational friends is you can count on between 10 and 30% of your members to not go with you. Evaluating the sustainability factors. So we Presbyterians are a mature lot, but if 95% of your income is coming from folks 95 years and older, and you've got a 5-year plan, well, evaluating that risk earlier as opposed to later is always a good idea. What considerations should be taken into account? We believe that having that disinterested third party is very helpful. You should also be aware that your optimism to do something new and exciting and different must be balanced with the pragmatism, the actual reality that you're dealing with limited funds, and a group of people that have a limited amount of energy. Inspiring them and getting them on board with a bold new vision is absolutely essential. These projects are often difficult. Even something as simple as selling a manse that a pastor hasn't occupied in 25 years. These things are often difficult. Most of the churches we work with tell us after the fact two things. Number one, it was harder than I thought it would be. Number two, we wish we had done it earlier. And as the old saying goes, if this was easy, somebody else would have already done it. So a couple of frequently encountered obstacles: absence of good financial data or timely financial data, an absence of the leadership's familiarity with the church's finances, that disproportionate dependence on a few families for the bulk of your ongoing revenues, as well as a certain naivete in terms of who's going to buy your property and how much they're willing to pay. And frankly, we've seen it go both ways. More often than not, congregational members believe that their campus is the crown jewel of the community, and they often way overestimate what a buyer would be willing to pay. On the other hand, we've worked in situations where even the appraisal came in surprisingly low. I can think of one in the southeastern United States where the selling price ended up being in excess of 4 times the appraised value. So this is something that you want to keep your expectations in check, and you want to do your homework, and you want to seek out expert guidance. Along with certain obstacles, let's look at patterns of success. They usually include strong leadership, both from the clergy and from the laity. So here's a rule of thumb that we have at the foundation. If we're working with a church and we discover we're only talking to one person, we get a little bit suspicious as to whether or not this initiative is going to get legs. Vision and goals have to be clearly defined. But we always encourage churches to commit this to writing, to review a written document at a session meeting, because what we have found is that sometimes when we talk about things, what I hear and what Mary Westphal said might not be the same. Clearly defining vision and goals, and then ultimately tactics. Realistic expectations. One of the questions that I often ask is, so you want your church to grow, and you believe the building is preventing folks from coming to your church. Well, that would run counter to what you typically hear from church growth experts. So we will ask the question, what type of visitor recruitment strategy do you have? What type of visitor retention strategy do you have? How do you convert first-time visitors to repeat visitors? How do you convert those repeat visitors into regular participants and even members? Having realistic expectations of how you are perceived in the community, not just your building, but your fellowship, is extraordinarily important. Now, any of my colleagues that might have dialed in are waiting for me to tell one of my stories. So here it comes. And this is a true story, unlike a lot of the ones that Joseph Moore tells. And so the story goes that I was working with a church. I won't say where it was. It was in the northeastern United States. And a few days later, I was in a meeting in Atlanta. It wasn't a church meeting. It had to do with a totally different side of my life. And I met someone who was from this same small suburb. And I said, oh gosh, I was there this week. I was working with ex-Presbyterian church. And his response was, oh, it's so sad. You know, that church closed. Well, I had been touring the sanctuary just days before. And when I told the gentleman, oh, no, actually the church is still open. Well, it went back and forth. He was convinced the church was closed because he walks his dog at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, and he walks by the church. The doors are always locked. The lights are always off. And there are no cars parked out front. And so I called the pastor the next morning and I told him what I had heard. And he said, well, yeah, you know, we don't keep the front doors open because they're big and they're heavy and you know what's coming next. Everybody always comes in the back. And there are no cars parked on the street because everybody knows to park in the back. And the sign is out of date because since nobody parks in the front and since nobody comes through the front door, well, there's no point in not talking about the Christmas Eve service from 2 years ago on the sign out front. Now, friends, this really happened. And when I told him about what one of the neighbors said, his response was, well, it doesn't sound like he's a church-going person. Well, we sure aren't making many efforts to change that, are we? And so knowing how the community perceives us, I was at this wonderful meeting a couple of years ago in the Presbytery of Western Reserve. And the Presbytery leader, after a couple hours of presentation, she said, okay, we're going to get up and we're going to go walk the neighborhood. We're going to see what's in the neighborhood. We're going to talk to the neighbors. And then when we got back, people talked about who they saw, and what they heard. So having realistic expectations of the likelihood of success, of what success even means, is critically important. Another success factor is a history of operational excellence. Do you have a track record of doing things well? Or are you one of those churches that argues and argues about every decision, and then you relitigate the decisions you've already made with every session meeting? Do you have clear, compelling communications? Do you have the ability to be discreet and hold information in confidence? If you're selling to a commercial developer, don't be surprised if they ask for a non-disclosure agreement, because they're probably not ready to announce the plans that they have for the parcel that you now own. Are you well organized? Do you pay attention to details? Selling a church property is 1,000 details that are best addressed in a certain sequence. And if some of those details are missed, it can slow, or in some cases, even kill off the process. So since I'm pretty sure this question is going to come up, I'll just go ahead and address it. Of the church property sales that we've been involved with, who are the most likely buyers? Number one, the most likely buyer is a non-denominational congregation. You may or may not like their theology or their polity, but those tend to be the most common buyers. The good news is your folks can feel good that it's still going to be a church. The bad news is those buyers tend to have issues with creditworthiness because they tend to be young startups, small startups, and they don't tend to have a whole lot of cash. So don't be surprised if they ask you to finance the sale. And the answer to that, as I speak on behalf of your presbytery, is almost always, no, we're not going to finance that sale. The second type of buyers that are most common are developers. It really depends on where you are. Is it an urban area? Is it a suburban area? Is it a rural area? Is it small town living? What's next door? We were working with a presbytery once that was considering the sale of its presbytery office. And they seemed a little bit surprised when I asked what retailers were next door. So if you've got Neiman Marcus next door, you're probably not going to get an offer from Dollar Tree. If you have hotels next door, you're probably not going to get an offer from a children's camp. And so thinking about where you are, and yes, the condition of your building does matter, but it probably matters more to you than it does to the buyer. Don't replace the carpet just because you think a buyer is going to want new carpet. And then the third category of likely buyers, and this one's a little bit surprising, is high net worth individuals who are interested in buying a church building to convert it into a residence or into condominiums. We've worked with several situations, and in fact, I'm going to be with a church tomorrow that sold its building to a contiguous property owner who wanted to convert that into a really terrific home and gathering space. So are you well organized? Do you have your finances in order? Do you understand the economic engine that is your ministry enterprise? If so, those are going to be really important foundations upon which to build this approach. We at the foundation have a wonderful team of ministry relations officers. We are happy to walk alongside you to point out what we have seen before, to offer the benefit of being objective and not having yet fallen in love with that building that you call your church home. You know, COVID's kind of interesting in that we've learned that we can exist and in some cases even thrive in the absence of occupying a church building. Now, many of us longed to get back into church. For many of us, myself included, and I'm younger than I look, for many of us, digital worship left a lot to be desired. But we've made it through COVID and we've made it through reasonably well. And so that lets us look at our facilities, our buildings, our excess holdings in a slightly different way. A wise man, Todd Bolsinger, said that leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. So to the presbytery leaders and to the pastors and to the ruling elders, part of your leadership may very well involve telling the congregation news that might not be welcome, news that might be disturbing. But I think Todd Bolsinger is onto something, that true leadership is disappointing our own folks at a speed and in a fashion that they can absorb, that they can react to, and then that they can move on from. So in my circle of friends, sometimes people say, what's the best part of working with churches? And the answer is obvious. You're working with people of faith who care genuinely about what they're doing. They care about their churches. They care about the mission and the outreach. They even care about the buildings. But then these same friends say, well, but what's the greatest frustration? Well, the greatest frustration is what Albert Einstein may or may not have said, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, but expecting a different result. The frustration is talking to churches that can't seem to make a decision. that are so struck by the pain of loss, of losing the familiar, that they are unable or perhaps unwilling to dream bigger dreams, to do new and exciting ministry. I'm reminded of the merger between University and Covenant Presbyterian churches in Tuscaloosa. If you were logged on in between, you saw a video about that. A church that had a lot of space, but not a lot of people. A church that had a lot of space, but not quite as many people as they needed. And coming together, these two very, very different congregations, dreaming bigger dreams and thinking about what they could accomplish together that was far greater than the sum of the two individual churches. It's a terrific story. Please feel free to go to the foundation website. You'll see a few of our videos there where our CEO, Tom Taylor, narrates the story of churches that have done bold things and accomplished great things in the process. That's the end of organized comments. And if there are any questions, Joseph and I would welcome those and would be happy to offer further details as might be appropriate.
There certainly are questions coming in. I would encourage people to continue to fill in the Q&A section. Paul, thank you for your remarks. Thanks for your work in the church for quite some number of years now. We are grateful for what you do. Someone brought up fairly early, which I know this will make you happy and maybe laugh a little bit. What happens to a cemetery if a building is sold?
Okay, so for those of you that work at the foundation that might be logged in, when I keep talking about cemeteries, this is why. The cemeteries are real estate. They are also real estate that carries with it perpetual responsibilities. What makes a cemetery so difficult? Well, what makes it difficult is you can't walk away. And for our Presbyterian leader friends that are on the call, if a congregation dissolves, the property trust clause flows both ways. And you end up perpetually responsible for a cemetery, a burial ground. Now, columbariums are different. We can talk about that offline. But cemeteries, nobody wants to buy a cemetery unless it is economically viable. And most Presbyterian cemeteries are not economically viable. I've been a cemetery trustee for over 2 decades. Excuse me. What makes cemeteries difficult? What makes it difficult is most of them are woefully underfunded. Cemeteries should have endowments attached that care for their perpetual upkeep and maintenance. So if you call me and you tell me that you've got a piece of real estate, first question I'm going to ask is it on the National Register of Historic Places? And the second question is, does it include a cemetery? If it includes a cemetery, the likelihood of it being sold drops by about 90%. Now, that being said, we have worked arrangements with other churches to assume cemeteries. We're working on 2 of those right now. We've worked on arrangements where the buying church assumes the cemetery. We've worked on situations where the city agrees to assume, if not the ownership, the upkeep and maintenance of those burial spaces. We're thinking about doing a webinar just on cemeteries. If you're interested, shoot me an email, shoot Joseph an email. We don't exactly know. We've actually done workshops in New Jersey. New Jersey has lots of cemeteries. The cemeteries are special places. They are also a disproportionate burden per square foot compared to every other type of religious property. That's probably enough about cemeteries for right now.
Still new to Zoom here. It looks like another question came up. How does being on the National Registry of Historic Places factor into this process? I'm also going to tie that to a question that was asked in Olanda and Robert's presentation about sort of what is responsible disposal, for lack of a better word, look like for some of our historic 150, 200-year-old churches. I think the two questions are related.
Yeah, I think they are related. So being on the National Register does not prevent you from selling your property. It doesn't prevent you from renovating parts. It simply adds a level of complexity. And so what we try to do is we try to identify what the complexity factors are early in the process, as opposed to very late in the process. So what about those historic buildings? I mean, I've been in PCUSA churches where, you know, the buildings are 300 years old. That can't be right. 200 years old. They're old. They're older than me, and I'm old. Sometimes it means that another worshiping community wants to cherish the facility that you occupy and wants to maintain the architectural integrity, the historic nature. Sometimes the presbytery will have a desire to do that. And in many cases, a local historic society, a historical society. One of the first ones I ever worked on was in a very small town in Georgia. And it was a historically significant church. And the city ended up assuming ownership in converting it to a community center. Now, the church had thought about doing that itself, but it was a little bit concerned about its tax exempt status, about unrelated business income taxes, and we can talk about that if you like. But in the case of the municipality was dead set on ensuring that that facility would be maintained. And so in talking with your ministry relations officer or any member of the foundation staff, we can point you to some resources so that these historic properties, we're not going to be able to save all of them. Let's be clear. We're not going to be able to save all of them. But these historic properties will at least be considered for some type of preservation and continuing use. It's a great question. Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks, Paul. So real quick, just so we can cover the sort of spectrum here, what's the smallest congregation you've worked at or worked with? What's the largest congregation you've worked with? And then we've got a whole bunch of other questions coming in.
Smallest, 4 members, 2 double first cousins. I had to go look it up. And I'm a Southerner and I had to look it up. Largest is probably about 2,500 members. We know that the data is that the churches that are most likely to enter into sharing relationships are medium-sized churches of between 100 and 250 members. And that's national data. That's not just PCUSA data. Most of the churches that we work with have well under 100 members. And of course, in the PCUSA, that accounts for half of our churches anyway. So probably not a surprise there.
Someone has asked, and this came up several times earlier in Olanda and Robert's presentation as well. Hi, Paul, will you be talking about the role of presbyteries in the process of selling? And I know that you touched on that, but it's clear that it is an issue that continues to come up for good reasons, because we want to do these things decently and in order. Any helpful tips, thoughts on that?
So if you work with a foundation person, one of the first things we're going to ask you is, have you talked with the Presbyterian folks yet? And what are the Presbyterian folks telling you? What is their process? So out of our 170, 160 some odd presbyteries, there are probably about 100 different approaches. We have gathered presbytery policies, and there is a striking variety in the process that is used, the use of proceeds, the decision-making, the authority. Some of our presbyteries are lucky enough to have real estate folks on staff. Karen Ebling, I saw your name on the list. I hope you're watching. Some of our presbyteries have fixed administrative commissions, permanent administrative commissions that deal with church property issues as they arise: purchase, leasing, borrowing, selling, redeveloping. Many presbyteries deal with church property sales and church property matters on a case-by-case basis. Our prediction is you're going to start to see more of an organized approach, simply because the national data is pretty clear. There are going to be a lot of churches that close because of aging membership, because we and others have very small congregations often, and the effects of COVID-19 are yet unknown. So presbytery has to be engaged. You want presbytery engaged earlier, not later. But how a process works really varies depending on the presbytery that you're in and depending on the policies that are in place.
Thanks. You mentioned that you could connect with someone offline about a columbarium. Is there sort of a generic answer, though, to the question, what about a location on church property where cremains are buried? Or is that just so specific for each particular thing that it really would involve an offline call?
Yes, and both. But I tell you what, if you're thinking about calling me or emailing me, I'll tell you the first question I'm going to ask, and talk about getting in the weeds here. A columbarium is above ground and contains cremated remains. They're called cremains. A scattering garden can be where ashes are distributed. In some cases, the earth is broken and the ashes are in fact buried. Those distinctions will play a very significant role in terms of the state regulations, because if you're burying ashes, your state probably considers that a burial ground. If you're simply scattering ashes, in most states, you have a much higher level of flexibility. Remember that cemeteries are regulated on a state level, not on a federal level. And in many states, there is a distinction between church-owned cemeteries and secular cemeteries, but plenty of churches have opted to go the secular route. So you're going to want to do a little bit of digging to find out what you've got. And yes, we'll be happy to help you.
Thanks. There's several questions that are kind of the same flavor, having to do with issues around tax exempt status, specifically when it comes to sharing space, leasing space. Do you have kind of general thoughts or advice that you typically give churches who are looking at leasing or sharing space?
Sure. It doesn't need to be as hard as most churches think it is, but there are challenges. Churches are, by definition, tax exempt enterprises. We churches have the most flexibility in our tax exempt status of any charities, and we don't even have to apply. We are deemed to be tax exempt. So there are two issues that come into play. Well, three issues. Your donors can claim a charitable deduction. Now, a lot of that changed in 2018 with the tax law changes, but very, very generous donors can still claim a charitable deduction if they itemize on their personal income taxes. Number two, there is the church's exemption from paying tax on the bulk of the income it receives. particularly contribution income. And those are actually two different things, although we think of them as together. And then you've got property tax issues. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I will tell you, more and more municipalities are looking much more aggressively at how church properties are being used, particularly in major urban areas. As a general rule, if you are renting or leasing your space to a tax-exempt organization whose purpose is generally within the confines of the church's exempt purpose. What is the church's exempt purpose? Divine fellowship, Christian education, fellowship of the believers. Divine worship, sorry. Divine worship, fellowship of the believers, Christian education. If you've got a preschool and it's tax exempt, you're probably in pretty good shape. If it's privately owned and it's taxable, then the rent that is paid could potentially be unrelated business income tax. So the first subject to unrelated business income tax. The first question you ask yourself is our potential renter taxable or tax exempt? And you ask for the paperwork. There is paperwork and it'll say tax exempt. If they don't have that paperwork, then you probably assume they're taxable unless they're a church. But just because you might have to pay unrelated business income tax doesn't mean that you should say no to every opportunity. If you look at the literature, kitchens in particular have gotten really, really popular. Church kitchens. If you have a commercial kitchen, Google up ghost kitchen, G-H-O-S-T, ghost kitchen, and you will find that there are lots of food entrepreneurs that have gotten into the delivery business through the course of the COVID-19 epidemic. Wall Street Journal did a whole piece on this within the last week or 10 days. So church kitchens have become popular. And then you do an economic cost benefit analysis of if it's a lot of income, it might be worth it to do that. You'll have to make some changes, safe child policy, your insurance status will change somewhat, and you might pay unrelated business income tax. Most of us don't quit our day jobs just because we have to pay income tax on our salaries and wages. And yet many churches say, no, we're not going to deal with a taxable organization even before they explore that. So that's the quick and dirty.
Yeah.
Anything else, Joseph? I see that we're running up on 6:30 Eastern time.
Yes, there are a couple more questions. One's related to, you mentioned church commercial kitchens are a possible revenue center. And also I would suggest a mission center in a congregation. Someone's asked, what are some other successful options to utilize our property to increase revenue, to begin to attract new members and to continue our ministry? In some ways, those are three different questions. But in terms of what you've seen when it comes to things churches have done creatively to increase revenue, any highlights you want to share?
Sure. We worked with a congregation in California that was a huge wedding venue. I mean, just spectacularly beautiful. And they had turned a pretty good system into place in organizing a wedding venue for those people who really wanted to get married. I'm not getting into theological. I didn't go to seminary. I see revenues, I see expenditures. Okay. That's one that quite a lot of churches will pursue. Of course, there's always the preschool model. There's the after school model. Adult daycare. Churches tend to be pretty well situated because of gathering spaces and fellowship halls. We have seen cafes. We have seen catering companies, obviously event space. We saw a church that did a spectacularly good job with its landscaping and ended up contracting out to others for landscaping services, bookstores, cafes, coffee shops. I'm trying to think, Robert, if you're listening, you and I dealt with one that's really, really interesting for the life. I mean, I can't think of what it is. Text me if you can read my mind and know what I'm thinking about. Parking. If you are in a university town, if you're in a Big Ten town or an SEC town, and you're anywhere close to the football stadium, there are significant opportunities. I live 45 minutes from Clemson University. Every church in the city of Clemson, South Carolina, sells parking spaces on game days. You think that might not be a lot of money, but one of the property owners I know, it's not the Presbyterian Church, one of the property owners that I know derives $60,000 a year in game day parking. That's pretty good money. Joseph, you and I were traveling recently. Help me remember what that church, were they going to do an event venue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's conversation around transformation into an event center.
Mm-hmm. Those would be some of the obvious ones.
Yeah. Related.
I'm sorry. One of the ones that I forgot was office space. Lots of churches have lots of empty classrooms. And so small charities in particular, or business startups, are often looking for office space that's easily accessible, has parking, and for which they don't have to sign a 3-year lease. That one's kind of obvious, I guess. I'm sorry, Joseph, go ahead.
No, someone had a follow-up question. What are the insurance expectations with these type of relationships within churches?
So if you take on a new tenant that is not a congregation, you can expect to see your insurance premiums increase because the risk to the insurer increases. A good rule of thumb is, before you make any decision, talk to your insurance agent, talk to the insurer, and say, hey, here's what we're thinking about. I know a church in Pennsylvania that owns undeveloped property, and they do hunting leases on that. There are certainly going to be liability insurance implications for that. If you're with one of the big three, Brotherhood Mutual, oh gosh, help me out, Guidestone,
Church Mutual,
or Church Mutual, or the insurance board, they will be very, very familiar with these types of discussions, and they are marvelous resources. Yeah. But anytime you're going to do something different with your church campus, you do want to talk to your insurance agent or the insurer directly.
Last question in the weeds here, and then we'll wrap up. In your experience, have you seen many churches successfully subdivide their property? Well,
it depends. It depends on whether the property is evenly divisible. We have worked with plenty of churches that have sold excess properties. If you can draw a straight line and segregate your property and still have parking, still have the road frontage that you expect, then the likelihood that you can sell that other parcel is probably pretty good. That being said, I'm familiar with churches that even have gone with a condo model, where the church is one of the owners, and then the back Christian education building of the one that I'm thinking about was turned into luxury market rate condominiums. And those folks actually own their condominiums. That's a lot more complicated, obviously, than selling off a parking lot that you're not using. But have we seen that? Oh, yeah, sure. In fact, that's not, remember, Presbyterians have good spaces. And a lot of our spaces are in very desirable real estate locations. And even if it's not a great location now, with gentrification, with all that brings, property values can easily go up.
Paul Grier, thank you so much. To our audience, to those who've participated today, thank you for being here. What a day. Please let us know at the Presbyterian Foundation how we can support you as together we make our way into the future that God has in store for us. Please, please, please remember you are not alone in this work. As we close our day of learning, this second day of learning that we've had, I imagine we will continue to do these. The response has just been almost overwhelming. We are open to ideas, and if there are things that you think, you know what, the church needs to think about X, Y, or Z, please let us know. And if it's something we can help resource, we will talk about it. So as we close, let us pray. Loving God, we are your people. This is your church. Rooted in hope, we pray that your will would be made clear, that we might be empowered to go where you would have us go. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Friends, thank you again for participating with the Presbyterian Foundation today. We are here for you. Let us know how we can help, and look for links to the presentations as well as the slide decks next Tuesday. Blessings.
So long, folks. Good day.